Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's officially good afternoon now. And thank you for coming out to the College of Social Sciences at the University of West Georgia's Into the Community. It is my distinct pleasure to be kicking off the 2017-2018 academic years into the community, and I'm very proud to have this opportunity. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Chapman Rackaway. Yes, that is my real name. There's no witness protection involved in that. And involved my parents, a family tradition, and a dare. But I am as of July 1, I am the new chair of the Department of Political Science at University of West Georgia. Very excited to be here and feeling very much at home here among the wolves in Carrollton. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about today so that you can get to know me, and it's a big part of my research agenda. The talk that I'm giving you today is based around this book, which came out from Lexington Press last year. It's called Operator Error, Civic Failure, and Its Threat to American Democracy. And it's really a labor of love from me. It started, interestingly enough, much like my name, on a dare. At my old institution, we were participants in the AASCU American Democracy Project, and there was a curricular development called Global Challenges. At that time, it was called 7 Revolutions. And the idea was building a class around 7 challenges to human society between that time and the year 2050. And one of them was governance. And so one of my colleagues dared me to give a speech on what the greatest threat to governance was in the current day and coming days. And that gave me a great opportunity to think about what that threat is and was at that time and will be. Because there are any number of threats that we can see to governance and to Republican, small r Republican, meaning representative democratic governance today. Obviously, the international arena presents any number of different threats, sometimes changing by the moment. I'm often reminded of how Mitt Romney, in his candidacy for the presidency in 2012, was pilloried during a debate for saying that he thought that the greatest foreign policy threat to the United States was not ISIS or ISIL, but was Russia. That was in 2012. Rather prescient, wouldn't you think? And so that kind of knowledge, the advantage that the perspective of being a political scientist gives me and others of my training is to think about what are the underlying root challenges, what's the really core stuff. Whether it's Russia, ISIL, whatever the great glowing threat of the moment is, whatever shiny object that might happen to be. Usually those things are symptoms of larger underlying causes. So let's get down to the root of things. What are those causes? And that's what the book gave me an opportunity to, and the initial speech back in 2010 that this allowed me to extend from. So to get you thinking about what this threat might be, let me start you with, of all things, a haiku. Garbage in and out. We get government we earn. Not quite what we want. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that our aspirations for what our government can and does do don't always align with what our government does. Now, this is a fundamental problem in a Republican democracy, as we'll talk about in a little bit, because Republican democracies are supposed to work for us. So if we are giving input to our government and they're producing different outputs, something's not right. So what that might be, which gets me thinking that maybe it's time to take the red pill. And there's no way I can do a good Lawrence Fishburne impression, but what have I told you? The politicians are just doing what they think we want them to do. And I think this is an important concept for us to wrap our heads around, because it is so easy for us to complain about the politicians. But it's almost too easy, it's too facile for us to say, oh, it's the politicians that are making this country wrong, or taking us down the rabbit hole. If that's the case, why haven't we already drained the swamp? Apologies to the president. But we have the opportunity to do that every 2 years. We could completely replace the entirety of the United States House of Representatives and an entire third of the US Congress, not to mention the entirety of the Georgia House of Representatives and every state assembly across the country. If we really wanted the revolution that we so desperately cling to and claim to embrace, well then, since I spent 10 years in Missouri, show me. And that's what we tend not to do. So I think it's important to go back to the beginning here. And to that end, I'm going to bring up great American, great thinker, historical icon, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was there at the Constitutional Convention. If there's anyone whose words may guide us in what this Constitution sets forth that we should be doing as a small r Republican, small d democracy, Franklin is probably a great lodestone for us here. And so I'm reminded of his emergence, along with the 55 other delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787. One of the hottest summers on record, and they were so secretive about their deliberations. They kept the doors and windows closed during the hottest summer Philadelphia had ever seen, in heavy wool clothes, breeches. I think the Madeira wine probably got them through. The bill for the convention included 182 casks of Madeira wine for 3 months. I'd say that's a pretty good haul. Even college students think, oh, that might be a problem. So after 3 months of secrecy, and with the country on the brink of collapse, Franklin and his cohort emerge from Independence Hall, and a woman goes up to him and says, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us, sir? And his words are before you. A republic, if you can keep it. There's 2 clauses in this sentence, and I'm going to direct you to the one that we never pay attention to. Most folks treat it like there's a period at the end of the second word. A republic. But to me, the most important, the vital part of this sentence is the second clause, if you can keep it. Franklin knew that citizen governance required some heavy lifting, and it required a commitment. He knew that governmental design was vital. That was what they had spent 3 months debating over. Governmental design. Sounds terrible to most people. To me, that sounds like one of the best vacations you can have. And also most of my grad school experience. But that's another story entirely. Franklin and that gang said, you've got to keep this thing up. And it's just like anything. It's a relationship. How do we manage our relationships? What do we put into them? What we put into our marriage, into our parental relationships, our work experiences, our friendships. We always get out what we put into it. Put in neglect, you're going to get neglect back, and that's key. That's a big clue for where we're going here. A republic, if you can keep it. Everyone's going to focus on the first 2 words. If you can keep it. Sometimes when people will come up to me and they'll just complain about things, I'll be very cryptic and I'll just murmur to myself, if you can keep it. Because we all have opinions. One of the jokes I used to share with one of my old colleagues, a great colleague back in Kansas. His name is Greg Farley. He's an ornithologist, and he's now the Dean of Science and Mathematics at my old institution. And I used to joke with him because I would say when Greg Farley introduces himself to someone and he says, yes, I'm an academic, I'm a biologist, I study birds, no one ever goes up to him and says, you know what's wrong with birds, mister? But the blessing and the curse of being a political scientist is, once I introduce myself as a political science, it is rant engaged for a lot of folks. And that's great. I love that. But what I'd love to see, and the point of my talk here today, is take that anger and channel it. Turn it into action. What we don't do is engage. And there are a lot of reasons why we don't engage, but there is a threat to that lack of engagement. And it is quite simply, in Republican terms, a public that is unwilling to be governed cannot be. And there are many markers that we have suggesting that we are becoming unwilling to accept governance. That doesn't mean that we bow to tyranny, but what it means is that we do not participate in the way that we are expected to in a democracy. And Federalist number 39, if you really want to get into it, is a great, great read on that. Since it was written by people in the 1700s and probably under the heavy influence of Madeira wine, I don't recommend looking at the Cliff's Notes version right now. But Federalist 39 really lays out that there is an expectation of citizen participation in information in a democracy that we have gotten away from. We tend to think today that the policy process works where elected officials and interests debate over policy outcomes, it comes out, and then we get a veto at the back end. Except that's wrong. And it's time for double jeopardy where the scores can really change. Because the political process was designed, the whole Constitution was set up that we should be the smartest, most active, most engaged, most critical minds involved in the political process, that it starts with us. Elected officials should be no more than middlemen. Even James Madison, during his debates at the Constitutional Convention, claimed that a president should be no more than a clerk. Now you think about that relative to the embrace of almost demagogic executive power, especially that we have seen over the last 17 years. And it's a bipartisan issue because both Bush and Trump and Obama have greatly embraced this surfeit of executive power that has come in. And it's because we as the voters here are asleep at the switch. When you take us out of the process, then elected officials decide on those policy outcomes with influence from whoever they happen to be around. There's a great example from my former state where, because the elected officials didn't get any people going to their town halls, they stopped holding them. Now, that didn't mean that they just sat around in their rented apartments during the 3 months of the Kansas legislative session and made decisions. There were people that were willing to talk to them, and they saw them and they heard them on a daily basis. Can you guess what kind of category of individual these folks would be?
Lobbyists.
Bingo. They are lobbyists. So elected officials aren't really controlled by interests. It's more that we have allowed interests to be the sole voice influencing elected officials. When that's all you hear, that's what you're going to think. Much like our choices of media today. If you select yourself into an echo chamber, you are going to be convinced that there is only one way to think and to act. Politically speaking, we've got the causal chain wrong, and we need to reclaim our knowledge and our participation here. Blame the politicians as much as you want, but if you're going to blame them, you ought to clean them out, and you better have a better idea, a better set of inputs to be able to make a change. Now, we didn't get here overnight. As a matter of fact, it took a long time to get here. And much like other things in politics, it's the law of unintended consequences. The most noble, most proper of intent ends up biting you on the backside later on. We had a problem in this country in the 1800s because our political parties were far too powerful. This is William Marcy Boss Tweed of the Democratic Party of New York City and their Society of the Sons of St. Tammany. The really archetypal political machine, where if you weren't a member of that party, you got nothing. None of the goods of government, none of the benefits of public policy accrued to you. It was join or be forgotten. So change was necessary. There had to have been a mechanism to change things. And during the early 1900s, the era of the progressives, we got a bunch of those things. We got a switch to the merit bureaucracy. We got the direct primary. We got nonpartisan local elections, which we mostly see in the more progressive West. We got initiative and referendum. We got direct election of U.S. senators. All of these things meant to undermine the political parties, but they undermined them so much that they turned parties from our most important linkage institution into a minor player in politics. And here's the other part of it that you have to know. For all of our negative talk about political parties, there is no better mechanism for informing, engaging, and mobilizing the public than active, strong political parties. And we have, not only the world's weakest parties, we have a weird parallax in the United States today. We have incredibly strong partisanship. We are highly polarized. We are highly negative towards the other party, while at the same time we have the smallest number of parties and they have the fewest functional powers of any institution in our politics, and certainly compared with those of other countries. But when we were at a higher level of turnout, it was largely because parties were able to organize elections, make them mean something, serve as a very strong information shortcut for the common voter, and they were able to do it fairly seamlessly. For all their ills, parties were not something to be destroyed. They were something to be reined in. And we went too far. When we took away the merit bureaucracy, we took away the ability of parties to dole out jobs to people, but that also meant that they could not ask for remissions from those people in their jobs, so they couldn't fundraise internally. We took the power of the parties to fund away. Parties who had been sponsors of or full owners of newspapers found themselves unable to maintain those. The independent press wasn't a market demand, it was a response to the fact that the parties couldn't support them anymore. And once the independent press arose, a different market dynamic came in. Because, say what you will about political parties and their bias, which I will stipulate to, at the end of it all, a party's main goal is to get you to vote and to vote for them. But today, CNN, the New York Times, even the Times-Georgian, is their primary goal, do they get a win if you're informed? No. Their job is to make money, and there's no problem with that. But we have to recognize that a profit-motivated media is going to entertain more than it's going to educate. And so we lose the informational piece that political parties brought as well. That's why I have this as the broken chain. We call in political science parties linkage institutions, because we as human beings are not really hardwired, well, some weirdos like me are, to be deeply engaged in this stuff, but not us at the mass level. Parties overcome that barrier, bring us in, get us active, get us engaged, get us excited, get us to give a damn. Without them, you don't give a damn. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned nonpartisan local elections a few minutes ago. The average turnout, anyone care to guess what the average turnout rate of nonpartisan elections in the United States is?
5%. Yeah.
5%. 70%. Only 1 in 20 people will cast a ballot in a nonpartisan, generally local election, which tend to have lower voter turnout anyways. But among city and county elections that are partisan, the voter turnout still sucks, but it's closer to 20%. So almost 4 times the amount of people. And that should tell you something. There is a multiplicative factor involved when we bring parties in. Or there is a divisive factor when we take parties out. So parties have lost their ability to be that linkage institution, but then we have also absorbed some of the problems ourselves. So I'm going to show you 2 slides here, and then I'll kind of sort this out for you. If you ask the public, and this is the best poll done on the American voting public, by the way, the University of Michigan's Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research's American National Election Study, done every presidential election year and most congressional election years dating back to 1952, surveying nearly 3,000 Americans. It is the gold standard of polling. This is no one with a laptop and an auto dialer trying to make something up on a Friday evening. This is the good stuff. The ANES, as we call it, asks people if they believe that the government wastes their tax money. And the answers are a lot, some, not very much, or don't know. So you can see the impetus among the public is the government's inefficient, they spend too much money, they need to cut their spending. So then, by extension of that, we should be able, in a fully functioning, well-functioning, efficiently functioning democracy, to be able to say to our elected officials, you might want to start in policy area X. So let's put that to the test. Where is the cut? Between 1980 and 2011, foreign aid, 7% more people said, yeah, you could cut foreign aid. But still, only 1 in 4 voters believes that foreign aid should be cut. Only 1 in 4. Regulatory agency, it's about half. Federal welfare spending, also about half. And everything else, less than half of folks say, don't cut, and in fact, spend more. So somewhere along the way, between the lack of party linkage between our own informational echo chambers, we have managed to convince ourselves that it is not only reasonable but healthy that we can hold 2 conflicting ideas in our heads at the same time. And then it'd be all well and good if we didn't then foist it on the people who actually make public policy, because these are the philosophies that guide our input towards elected officials. And I can give you chapter and verse on this. My old institution, we had a public policy polling entity called the Docking Institute of Public Affairs, and I was part of their statewide survey, Kansas Speaks. For a while, we asked people, would you rather cut taxes or increase spending on your governmental budget? And folks just said, cut taxes, cut taxes, cut taxes. Great. We elect a guy named Sam Brownback. What does he do? He cuts taxes. Great. Now you got to cut spending. Oh, let's not go crazy there, Sam. And so between the early writing of this book and what was happening there, I decided it's time to disaggregate. So we asked one question about cutting taxes, we asked the other about spending. And here's what we found consistently over the course of 3 years when we asked that question. A, everyone favored cutting taxes. 75% of Kansas Speaks respondents said cut taxes. 80% of that state's budget was made up of K-12 education, higher education, and social services spending. And more than 70% of respondents said, don't cut any of the 3 of those, but spend more money on those. So cut my taxes, but spend more money. If you've ever said, man, this politician seems schizophrenic. Maybe it's because we drove him crazy. Because we consistently continue to expect incommensurate things from our government. We expect there is a wellspring of money that will just pop up if we cut taxes and allow spending to increase. And the corollary of that is also true. We want to cut those taxes, but we don't want to cut spending. You can make whichever decision you want. I include no editorial comment in there other than the fact that you've got to choose one. And we have convinced ourselves that we need not choose. Meaning, to go back to my haiku with garbage in, garbage out, if we expect the impossible, how in the world can our politicians satisfy the expectations of those of us who are supposed to be the smartest, most engaged, biggest decision makers? This is the problem that we have arrived at. This is what I mean by civic failure. And so what we have done is we have replaced the town hall, the letter to our member of Congress, with slacktivism. It just gave me an excuse to use a Wonka meme. I'm not going to lie to you. I am not going to lie to you. But the darker side of this is that when we expect unreasonable things and we don't get them, then we exacerbate the problem by, rather than going in there, cleaning things out, draining the swamp, if you will, we decide, well, that's it. I don't need to vote because ain't nothing going to be done that I want. And that's what happens. We distance ourselves from our government. The folks who respond none of the time or some of the time to the question in the ANES about how much trust they have in the federal government. And you can see it's going in the wrong direction. Nearly 70% some of the time. None of the time is still pretty low, but the trend line looks like it's going to cross from the just about always folks. And those in the middle, dropping down. We don't trust our government. We don't trust each other. One of the inspirations for the speech in the book was a great, great work by Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist. He wrote a book in the 1990s called Bowling Alone. Changed everything about my career and my research agenda. And I became fascinated with social capital. Spot on. Our unwillingness to join civic organizations, to be part of churches, to be in bowling leagues, to be together, has gone away. And we've replaced it with screens, some of which is engaging, but it's not authentic interpersonal engagement. And there is research on online social capital, which shows that it's not nearly as strong as good old-fashioned in-person social capital. I love my technology, but I also have to recognize its limitations. And if our trust in each other and the federal government is gone, and it doesn't mean that we have to be Pollyannas. We don't have to all say that we trust it all the time. But we have to believe that we have an efficient mechanism of changing it when it gets out of line. Instead, we feel as though we have no mechanism to change. And that's the problem. We have it, we're not using it. And so we use it in the wrong ways. And I spend a couple of chapters in the book, one part of the book, is just where I encapsulate this attitude in a number of different areas. The two most notable are the push for term limits and the push for campaign finance reform. And there's plenty of empirical data out there that shows why these are really troubling public policies. They sound great. Let's get money out of politics. Let's drain that swamp. The problem is we've got term limits. It's called a ballot box, and we're not using it because 90% of all incumbents who run for office get returned. Term limits can change that? Come on. Who are you talking to? No, it's not going to change anything. We are the root cause. If we don't change term limits, all it does and I talk about this at length in the chapter, all that it does is empower the permanent staff and lobbyists who aren't term limited, who we hate even more than the politicians. So talk about the law of unintended consequences. And campaign finance reform the same way. It's a noble idea to try to reduce the amount of money in politics. But every time we put different caps on, rather than moving to disclosure, we end up increasing the amount of money in politics rather than reducing it. And worse than that, the last reforms that we engaged in, 2002's Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, actually allowed a larger and ever-growing class of donors to avoid disclosure, which empirical evidence shows is the best way to clean up politics, is to let us and let journalists see every dollar raised and spent by a politician. And by increasing the amount of dark money, and forget about the amounts, it's the lack of disclosure that really kicks us in the backside when it comes to campaign finance reform. But again, it's the easy way out. We think we'll drop the limits and everything is going to be glorious, not realizing, no, we need more disclosure, we need to do more research and more digging so we can find out what's really going on. But we don't want to be bothered with that. We're disengaged. And that combination is really toxic. So that takes a lot of what I talk about in the book, but I kind of want to wrap, because I also know that you may have some questions and probably some concerns about what I'm saying, because I know this is counterintuitive for a lot of people. But I really got the impetus to write the book, moving from speeches to writing the book, when I saw the Arab Spring playing out. Because we were all high on the idea that the Arab Spring was this push for democracy and that real change to more Western-style representation was going to be happening in these countries with a long history of totalitarian repression. And I was worried about that because we seem to be making an assumption that we shouldn't have made. And in so many of those revolutions, they weren't like us in 1776. There wasn't this passion for self-governance. Many of these folks believed that they were trying to change a regime to something that would provide even more order, a stronger hand. You get rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and you replace him with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that was not by accident. Not at all. Brexit becomes another example of that. We know we don't like what we have, but we don't have an alternative. And that can be really, really dangerous. When you don't have an alternative, when you can't say, I want to improve this, all you're doing is destroying. And it is, at its core, inherently anarchic, anti-government. Regardless of what kind of government we want, very few of us believe that anarchy is a viable form of governance. And yet that is what underlies these ideas. Change our government, but don't replace it with anything. And so as we see the decay of civic engagement and involvement in the US, the warning signs of this kind of unguided missile of the public continue to haunt us. The end product is somewhat desultory. It is a standoff. Politicians aren't budging. Others aren't budging. They've got a very comfortable system. And we're sitting there saying, change, but we're not going to make you. The very essence of civic failure. I'll turn it over to you now.